a sign that they should be ready, but actually they are not ready. So. Buongiorno, buon pomeriggio a tutti, benvenuti a questo incontro del festival. È un piacere per me oggi introdurre il professor MOKYR e la sua lezione, che è al titolo in italiano La stagnazione secolare è il nostro destino. Vedete il titolo in inglese, la relazione sarà in inglese, e vorrei spendere solo qualche parola di introduzione sul nostro gradito ospite e sul tema della giornata, anche se non mi dilungherò molto perché chiaramente siete venuti qui ad ascoltare MOKYR e non me. Il professor MOKYR è Robert Strauss Professor of Arts and Science and Professor of Economics and History al Dipartimento di Economia della Northwestern University, e ha also una posizione nella Università di Tel Aviv. È stato visiting in innumerevoli università prestigiosissime, è stato fellow di numerose accademie e società internazionali, e nel 2018 è stato anche eletto Distinguished Fellow dell'American Economic Association. Come storico economico si è occupato di moltissimi temi, ma in modo particolare di crescita, di sviluppo economico, di tecnologia e progresso tecnologico, in particolar modo a partire dalla rivoluzione industriale, ponendo soprattutto l'enfasi sulla relazione che c'è tra cultura, istituzioni e progresso e innovazione, quindi guardando anche alle radici economiche e intellettuali del progresso. Ha scritto numerosi articoli e libri, molti dei quali premiati, e anche di recente, nel 2015, gli è stato attribuito il premio, il Balzan International Prize per la storia economica. L'ultimo libro che ha scritto si intitola in inglese A Culture of Growth, Origins of the Modern Economy. In italiano è stato tradotto dal Mulino con il titolo Una cultura della crescita, le origini dell'economia moderna, ed è appunto uscito l'anno scorso. Proprio l'anno scorso il professor MOKYR sarebbe dovuto essere qui presente al festival per presentare questo nuovo libro, ma non ha potuto per un intervento chirurgico che, come vedete, è andato assolutamente bene, e quindi scherzavamo per email dicendo che lui oggi con la sua presenza testimonia l'importanza del progresso tecnologico e l'importanza della conoscenza, che produce risultati anche diversi da quello che normalmente noi misuriamo in termini di PIL, di GDP. Questo libro di cui vi facevo accenno si concentra sulla rivoluzione industriale, e il professore spiega come mai questa rivoluzione è avvenuta in certi luoghi, in un certo periodo di tempo e non in altri, facendo riferimento proprio al contesto culturale, alla possibilità per le idee generate in vari luoghi di diffondersi in Europa in quel periodo. Mentre il tema di oggi è diverso ma connesso, ed è quello della stagnazione secolare. Con la stagnazione secolare è diciamo così, uno scenario che molti temono, che paventano, altri, come sentirete, credono invece meno probabile, ovvero un periodo di crescita bassi tassi per un periodo prolungato. Un fenomeno che si è osservato negli ultimi anni, che si è associato ad una serie di altre, per così dire, stranezze, ovvero una diminuzione nella quota del prodotto interno lordo che va al lavoro, un aumento della concentrazione industriale, grandi colossi che acquistano quote di mercato sempre più grandi, l'invecchiamento della popolazione, l'abbassamento dei tassi di interesse. Che se ci sia una relazione tra queste diverse grandezze non è ancora chiaro, le posizioni sono diverse e la ricerca prosegue. Il fatto che ci sia un rischio di stagnazione secolare è però animato un grande dibattito, perché se la torta non cresce, ovviamente anche i problemi redistributivi aumentano. Quindi qualcuno ha anche osservato, vediamo moltissime innovazioni, moltissime invenzioni, come queste si trasmettono in crescita della produttività e poi in crescita del prodotto. Sentiremo dal professor MOKYR che forse alcune di queste domande non sono completamente corrette o ben poste, o forse non sono veramente il problema di cui dovremmo occuparci. Quindi quello che oggi il professore farà sarà quello di aiutarci a guardare a questo tema, a questa possibilità, a questo scenario di lungo termine, guardando anche indietro, chiaramente, per coglierne gli effetti diretti e indiretti, per cogliere il ruolo del progresso tecnologico che appunto, oltre a permetterci di avere il professore qui di nuovo quest'anno, porta un insieme di risultati positivi per tutti noi. Con questo io mi taccio e invito il professore a iniziare la sua lezione, ringraziandolo per essere venuto ancora.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and I'm indeed very glad to be here since, last year I underwent a procedure and I was told by my doctors that if I'd had this 50 years earlier, I would have been quite dead. And here I am, and I'm reasonable alive, or you'll be the judges of that. Anyway, what I'm going to do today is, violate something in the Jewish tradition, because it says in our Talmud that since our second temple was destroyed, the art of prophecy was given to the fools. And I'm going to make a fool out of myself here by actually making very careful and very conditional predictions, but I'm going to say something about the future, but I'm going to do that on the basis of some kind of historical experience and facts. So let's get going. So here's the question. Are we worried about secular stagnation? And secular stagnation has been raised recently from its well-deserved ashes by none other than the great Larry Summers. And, is he worried about technological stagnation? Well, it seems he is from this picture. Another person who's worried about secular stagnation from a somewhat different point of view is my learned but misguided colleague, Robert J. Gordon. There's Bob. And in this book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth, he predicts something akin to secular stagnation, also from a somewhat different point of view of Summers, I should say, but both have this sort of view that the best days of growth are behind us and that we have nothing but slow growth or stagnation to look forward to. So this is Larry's article. It was published in Foreign Affairs a few years back, and he is citing, as he should have, the great economist Alvin Hansen as the sort of prophet of secular stagnation. And so just give you a little bit of sort of history of thought before I get into the actual matter. Here is Hansen, who was, of course, most famous for introducing Keynesian economics to the United States, but in his presidential address published in the American Economic Review in 1939, he really predicted that the best days were over now and economic growth was going to slow down to a trickle. So basically, Hansen's view was, of course, largely Keynesian in notion. He thought that there would be inadequate aggregate demand, and in part this was because of population growth, it slowed down to a trickle, and he said because technological progress was too slow and could not save it. So here's a little bit of a citation from Hansen. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can sort of see that there is a technological pessimism underlying that when he says, together with the failure of any really important innovations of a magnitude sufficient to absorb large capital outlays, and blah, 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 and then investment is going to fall and not be sufficient, and we'll all go into secular stagnation. Now, of course, that prediction, as the Talmud, pointed out, turned out to be spectacularly wrong. And we all basically know why, right? I mean, in 1939, Hansen failed to foresee World War II. He also failed to foresee the pent-up consumer demand that was unleashed in 1945, the subsequent baby boom, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of which essentially implied the reverse of secular stagnation, which is rapid post-war growth, accompanied for most of the time by inflation. And of course, he also completely failed to foresee the technological progress that was going to happen in the second half of the 20th century. So that, of course, tells us that it was wrong then, but would it be wrong today? Oops, sorry. And so what I want to make a point that's actually a rather commonplace once you think about it, and that is economic historians, of course, don't have a problem with the concept of secular stagnation, because before the Industrial Revolution, say roughly speaking 1800, that's all there was. Anywhere in the world, basically, nobody would have complained about secular stagnation because that's what everybody was used to. And the notion of sustained growth at the kind of rates that we have experienced were absolutely unheard of. Now, this is not to say there was no growth at all. That would be too strong a statement. But growth such as it was used to be very, very slow, at least in the longer term. And unlike today, I think it is much more reversible and vulnerable to external shocks, such as political shocks. And most important, perhaps, the growth that existed was based mostly on what we call Smithian effects. That is to say, the kind of growth that occurs due to growing international trade, better property rights, better markets, things like that, but not necessarily driven by sustained rapid technological progress. And so what happens in the Industrial Revolution is more than just, the famous hockey stick effect that we all teach in our classes. It really is what the physicists would call a phase transition. The whole dynamic mechanism of producing and consuming and output changed dramatically in the sense that increasingly the engine of growth became growth in knowledge, which is sort of a nice word of saying it's, essentially technologically driven. And what has happened is that not only growth became more rapid, it also became much less vulnerable to natural or political shocks. So here are some recent numbers, and I'm not wild about these long-term GDP statistics for all the reasons that we teach in our undergraduate classes, but it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about. So you look at most of those countries, and you see that growth actually happens. For instance, growth in the Dutch Republic is very remarkable in the late Middle Ages and early modern period of time. But then, of course, after about 1600, it stops, and there's very little growth, for the next 250 years. You look at Italy, it's even worse. They reach a high level, of course, in the Renaissance period. But then essentially, in terms of GDP per capita, very little happens until the middle of the 19th century. Then you look at China, and it's even worse. They reach this peak, and as is well known, in the Song dynasty, which is in sort of around 900 to 1100. And then essentially it declines and continues to decline until the middle of the 19th century. And it's not any better in Spain, in Italy, and on and on and on. The only country where you can sort of see sustainable growth happening, and it's happening right at the time of the Industrial Revolution, is, of course, in Britain. But this sort of exemplifies the kind of story that I was trying to tell. And so now is a very naive question that only somebody living in the 21st century who thinks of history in sort of teleological terms, as my historians would call this somewhat disparagingly. Why is this really true? Why could there be no sustained, irreversible growth before the Industrial Revolution? And I'm going to give you three phenomena that I think matter more than anything else, and then analyze them one at a time to show to what extent they hold today. That's basically the outline of the talk. So there are three classes of these phenomena. The first two are what you'd call negative feedback. Essentially, growth creates the conditions of its own undoing in what Marxians would call dialectical terms, right? So you get growth, and then growth creates something that undoes growth. Okay? So the first most obvious thing, and this is what many economists still believe, is Malthusian negative feedback, and that's sort of the sort of standard Malthusian model, which we all know and some of us love. And it's the basic idea, of course, is that income per capita goes up, people have more babies, or more babies survive, or they get married younger, or something like that, and then the population goes up, population puts pressure on the resources, and voila, income goes down again. And this is nothing more than essentially the iron law of wages. A somewhat less well-known but equally important phenomenon is what I call institutional negative feedback. And then what happens is if they have a region or a town in which growth occurs, somebody looks at that and says, wow, these people have money. Let's go take it, okay? So this is the sort of what I call the sort of a Willie Sutton sort of model. And Willie Sutton was asked, why he robbed banks, and the answer is that's where the money is. And so this is basically the story of, say, northern Italy, which was quite rich, as you could see, but continuously attracted predators from either France or Spain or other places who in some sense tried to rob it. The same happened in southern Germany, the same happened in Flanders, and mutatis mutandis, very similar things happened in China. There's also internal rent seeking, in which basically you don't have to have some outside predator to come in, but it's basically local tax collectors or other kind of predators who come in and take the resources. And the third is slightly different, but in my view, equally important. And that is the concept of what I call a narrow epistemic base of technology, which is a fancy term to basically point out that people had techniques and they made things, but nobody had any idea of why the things that they were doing actually worked. And if you don't know why something worked, of course, it's very hard to make it work better, and it's also probably a prescription to try all kinds of things that don't work. So that's basically it. So the Malthusian model, as I said, is just basically the classical iron law of wages, in which, and there's not much I need to add about it, except there's a beautiful quote that I always give to my students, which is from H.G. Wells, in which he says, "Humanity spent the great gifts of science as rapidly as it got them in a mere insensate multiplication of the common life." You know, this doesn't tell you anything you didn't know before, but it sounds so good. The institutional negative feedback, of course, is the basis of a fair amount of work. I mean, I can just cite, of course, the Acemoglu-Robinson book. This is a description of what they call the extractive society, or what North Wallace-Weingast called the natural state. And so this is basically the helpful distinction, I think, is here one by Mansur Olson. And Olson distinguished between these roving bandits, who are basically people coming in from the outside, you know, essentially pillaging, plundering, and burning and leaving. And there's local people who are stationary bandits. But they both basically create, it's not just that they destroy physical capital and kill people, but they create negative incentives, right? So if you know that by making money, you're going to attract somebody who will come in and take it away from you by violent means, that creates a disincentive to make the effort in the first place. And so, as far as the narrow epistemic base of technology, maybe I'll just give you one quote that I like very much, and this way we will drive it home. It says it was a world of engineering without mechanics, iron making without metallurgy, farming without soil science, mining without geology, water power without hydraulics, dye making without organic chemistry, and medical practice without microbiology and immunology. So people did things, but they had no good idea of why they worked, and invention occurred through luck or learning by doing or endless experimentation, but not by any sort of fundamental basis of understanding it. So the point I'm making here is that by the 19th century, all those three mechanisms in one form or another were either fatally weakened or completely disappeared. So the Malthusian feedback mechanism, is, by everybody's agreement, has basically disappeared by the beginning of the 19th century, at least in Europe. The world undergoes, some earlier, some later, a fertility transition, and birth rate starts to plummet, and the whole sort of Malthusian sort of regime disintegrates in the late 18th, early 19th century. As far as rent-seeking is concerned, and this is not all that much appreciated, after Napoleon, who may have been sort of the last roving bandit, in fact, that's what he did. I mean, you Italians should know this better than anybody else. And Napoleon was basically a predator, right, who stole things. I mean, he gets good press in France, but elsewhere we know what he was about. But after 1815, this kind of behavior within Europe largely disappears, which is to say, it disappears within Europe. It does not disappear in the rest of the world, because what the Europeans did is, instead of robbing one another, which they had been doing for centuries, they now start to rob, other continents. But at least within Europe, wars that were predatory in nature disappears. And that, of course, means that smaller nations no longer had to worry about their more stronger neighbors who would come in and take their wealth. And it's also true that rent-seeking as a general phenomenon starts to decline in Europe in the 19th century. And you see this in all kinds of phenomena, but the best known perhaps is the fact of the rise of free trade, that basically from 1815 on until about the closing decades of the 19th century, we see free trade becoming very widespread in Europe. And free trade, of course, is a response to the rent-seeking implied in protectionist policies. So I think you can see this in all kind of phenomena in which corruption and protectionism decline in Europe, at least until about 1900. After that, it's a different story. And most dramatically, of course, and this is not news to anybody in this room, is that in the 19th century, science, chemistry, biology, physics, you name it, is increasingly more powerful in explaining why the things that work for us actually work. Moreover, of course, it generates entirely new ones. And so those three reversals basically describe much of this sort of unprecedented great enrichment. You know, the great enrichment is a term that I like better than the great divergence, because the great divergence really talks about relative gaps between Europe and the East. And the great enrichment actually underlines the fact that everybody got richer, not just the West, but the rest of the world as well, also at a later stage. And so, using those three mechanisms, what kind of predictions can we make about the future, and how likely is it that we will return to the earlier days of low or negligible growth? So this is then what I'm going to be doing for the rest of this talk. Let me first talk a little bit about population and demography. So Malthusianism is actually a hardy weed to eradicate. So there are still some neo-Malthusians in the world, like this Paul Ehrlich at Stanford, for instance, who wrote this famous 1968 book called The Population Bomb, which, you know, I think that the term is actually appropriate because the book really is a bomb in my view, in the sense that it was spectacularly wrong. But he is unreformed. You know, he still maintains that, you know, there's going to be some Malthusian disaster. As I see it, and I think most people would agree, our own age, the problem is the reverse, much like Hansen actually worried about. Population in the West is growing too slowly, much slower than it was growing in the time of Alvin Hansen. And what's more, of course, and we all know why, because it's driven by low and declining fertility, which is to some extent offset by rising life expectancy, but it's not good enough. So eventually population is going to start declining. But the side effect, of course, is this general phenomenon called population aging. And so you could argue that population aging is a Malthusian-like phenomenon because it's too a form of negative feedback in which growth creates the mechanism to undo itself, right? This time it's not population pressure, it's aging, but maybe aging is pretty bad too. So here you see some data about aging. Okay, this is the ratio of people of older to middle-aged workers, and you can sort of see that this ratio is rising everywhere. Some nations faster, some nations slower, but it's clearly a worldwide phenomenon. Okay, in median population age, is projected to rise in some places quite dramatically. In Germany, for instance, from 38 to 51, in China from 35 to 46, in Korea to 53. And the old age dependency ratio, given current, of course, retirement limits, will rise from 13% to 38% by the end of this. This is a very serious phenomenon, or so it seems. Okay, so in Italy, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It turns out the region of Liguria has the highest ratio of elderly to youth in the world. I'm not totally sure why, but that's how it is. The proportion of population today is about 30% over 60. That will be 40% by 2050. So, you know, this is aging. Now, you know, is this the good news or the bad news? You know, it's not totally obvious to me. It is the result of past economic growth and technological change, right? So the mechanisms are complicated, but they are all related in some way or another to economic progress. And so, could aging become the driving force behind secular stagnation? This would be sort of Malthus's revenge, if you want. Okay. And so, one thing that I guess where Hansen was spectacularly wrong is that he thought it would be demand-driven secular stagnation because there wouldn't be enough investment or aggregate demand. My sense is that if aging does anything, it will cause aggregate demand to rise faster than aggregate supply, in part because dependency rates go up. So we have pensioners are dissaving, and this may not be great news perhaps, but it certainly mitigates any concerns that we have about secular stagnation that's driven by inadequate demand. Moreover, as the population is aging, I think the crushing expenses of both medical care and pension payments are going to create deficits in every country in which these arrangements exist. And I find it hard to see how these countries will ever suffer from insufficient aggregate demand. Now, the other thing, of course, is that rising dependency ratios will reduce GDP as we traditionally measure it. But I'd like to remind everybody in this room that that only is the case because we do not place an economic value on voluntary leisure. So retirement and the golden years, something like that, are a case of voluntary leisure. We don't put a value that it's not measured in GDP. Also, Nordhaus and Tobin told us in 1972 that that's what we should do, but we haven't done that. And so, if you do that, actually, you add that to GDP. It's not obvious at all that GDP, as properly measured, will decline. And what's more, of course, is that getting old, as I was saying, interacts with modern technology to produce a much sharper rise in quality-adjusted life years, in the sense that the quality of life, not only the people getting older, but they are much able to enjoy life. And so the total consumer surplus that they're getting from that is vastly understated just by measuring their life expectancy. And in any case, even if you go for the traditional definition of GDP, which I'm urging you not to do, there is no good connection between aging and change in GDP, at least to date. So this is the change in GDP, and this is the change in the ratio of senior to middle-aged workers, and you really get very little, if any effect at all. So it's basically zero. That doesn't mean it's going to be zero in the future. It just means to date it's zero. Now here's one more point that people often raise, and I raised myself. And that is, well, some think that because there are too many sort of old fogies in the economy, this will somehow affect the dynamism of the economy, because we have this notion that the best entrepreneurs, people like Zuckerberg and Jobs and Gates, did their best work when they were young, and now as the ratio of young people to old people is declining, we will have fewer of those. Well, first, this turns out to be a myth. There's a paper by Pierre Azoulay and others recently that shows that among the 0.1% of startups based on growth in their first 5 years, the founders started their companies on average when they were 45 years old. So that's still going to be somewhat below the median, but it's not people in their sort of, early 20s as the popular conception sometimes run. Now, are we going to be running out of young people aged 45 or so? And so, aging will mean that their total supply in the very long run will diminish. But my sense is that what really matters here is sort of upper tail human capital. That's to say the ability of the people in the very top of our engineering and scientific and ability skills. And so many other factors could offset the decline in their numbers. And if lower quantity means higher quality and family size, actually the supply of these sort of high quality young people could actually go up, even if their overall number goes down. So I don't lose much sleep over this. It's also been documented by a paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo that in fact robotization is faster when they're older workers, and so as older workers become scarce and expensive, firms replace them by robots. And so here you have some these curves. The one concern I have with aging is that if the rate of technological change will accelerate, as I will argue it does, aging means that the flexibility, all other things equal, of the labor force may be declining. In other words, it may become increasingly difficult to teach middle-aged dogs new tricks, so to speak. And so, you know, people in their 50s and 60s may still be in the labor force, but it may be increasingly difficult to retrain them because your ability to acquire new skills, sad to tell you, does decline with age, much as you will try. And so if this happens, I can see serious problems there, not only in what happens to these older workers who may no longer be able to retrain, but also the fact that they will resist technological progress or feel bitter and angry about it and vote for parties that may be less receptive to progress. There also is an issue of environmental pressure. I'm not going to say very much about this, except the following. The neo-Malthusian of this world believe that what has happened in the past is that we have grown by using inordinate amounts of minerals and fossil fuels. And that if we continue to grow like that, eventually the earth will run out of resources, even if the number of people doesn't keep growing. So it's just the pressure on fixed resources. But I am unwilling to accept the fact that just because in the past economic growth has been heavily fossil fuel using and metal using and so on, that is the way of the future. In fact, that's a matter of prices and it's a matter of incentives, and it's in our capability to change that and change the sources of energy, and in fact that is precisely what we will do. So, in the past, of course, I think ingenuity will trump Malthus, as it has done in the 19th century. So there's all kind of examples that I can give you about new technologies in which we, responding to this pressure on resources. You can think of LED lighting, which uses a fraction of the electricity of regular incandescent light bulbs. We can think about plastic waste, which we are eventually going to have to deal with. And of course, there is the growing interest in sort of what's known as beefless beef, and this is clearly will reduce pressure on resources a great deal. All right, that's the sort of Malthusian story. Let me say something about institutions and what about institutional feedback. Will growth be done in by rent seeking and other forms of predatory behavior? And here I wish that I could be as unambiguously positive as I'd like to be, but I can't. Okay? The story is more nuanced. So the international roving bandits, I think that are characterize so much of history, is probably going to be moderate. I mean, the last example that comes to mind is the invasion of Kuwait in 1991, which is a sort of classic sort of roving bandit kind of action, and the international order did not accept that and basically undid this with the usual story that you all know. So I think at this point, small but rich countries, like Luxembourg or Singapore, at this point don't have much to fear. But I can't be sure that will not continue, and I'm not totally sure that Western powers, which showed so much resolve in 1990, will continue to show that kind of resolve. And in fact, the predatory nature may change its character, and we may see things like nuclear blackmail, which is, of course, a major concern that everybody is worried about with North Korea and other countries. So I can't guarantee that will completely disappear. The internal rent-seeking, or the stationary bandits, is much more ambiguous. And here, the big question is corruption. And, it's a very hard question to ask if is the world getting more or less corrupt, because we don't have, of course, a precise metric of corruption. What we have are these Transparency International and World Bank data banks, which give you the corruption in each country, but these are all based on subjective perceptions, and it's not totally clear how comparable they are among nations or over time. That said, you just look at those maps or those tables, and what strikes you is the sort of world. There's sort of three kinds of nations. Okay, there are highly successful nations where corruption is essentially negligible. Norway, New Zealand, Singapore, the Netherlands, and so on, where it's not really a factor. Then there are countries in which corruption, at least on the surface, seems to be pervasive, but it doesn't seem to be able to affect the rate of growth, at least not to date. And so you think about places like China or Indonesia or Turkey, Illinois, places like that, highly corrupt, but they're still economically dynamic. But we have on this planet a large number of countries there. Kleptocracy and rent extraction are so pervasive and so strong that they really imperil the fundamentals of economic growth, such as property rights, contract enforcement. They affect the supply and quality of public goods and suppress entrepreneurships and investment. So you look at countries like Nigeria, Guatemala, Russia, large chunks of the world just seem to follow that. And what you'd like to see is at least countries from class 3 slowly moving into class 2. And according to the World Bank, at least, this has happened to a few countries like Rwanda and Romania. Hopefully it will happen elsewhere, but the evidence for that so far isn't home. And in fact, it's not clear that globalization, even if it survives, is going to help there a great deal, because the evidence that joining transnational organizations where corruption is looked down upon, that will reduce corruption, the evidence for that is not strong. The hope was that when countries like Romania and Bulgaria joined the EU, that somehow being part of this community would reduce corruption. Reading the latest news from Romania doesn't seem to be terribly reassuring about that, and it certainly has done very little for Greece. So this is clearly something where we've and in fact, if you look at the United States, where we have 50 states, there's an enormous degree of variation in the degree of corruption within each state, going all the way down from Minnesota and the Dakotas, where corruption is very low, to a large number of states, ranging all the way from Illinois down to Louisiana, where corruption is still quite serious. So the one thing I would say is that at least history provides some hope about corruption, because you have to remember that the world on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, say around 1720, even Britain was by our standards an incredibly corrupt country, and that mercantilism really is a theory of rent-seeking. And so after, say, 1720 or 1730, there's a growing reaction against that. And if you read people like Adam Smith and his entire sort of school of people he influenced, they really, you can see that rent-seeking starts going into some kind of tailspin, because it is regarded as immoral and bad for business. And so, at least until 1900, I think rent-seeking as a whole in Europe disappears. Not altogether and not everywhere, but clearly is in decline. It has happened before. Hopefully it could happen again. That said, we talk about, economic historians talk about technological progress, but we talk about institutional change. And there's a reason for that, because the evidence for institutional progress, that in some sense institutions get better monotonically over time, that evidence is really not very strong. There have been periods in which we would all agree are periods of institutional improvement, but they've been punctuated by periods of sharp institutional decline, particularly the 1930s, and I hate to say it, but we all know it, the years after 2008 until the present day. And so if institutional progress occurs, it really occurs in the way that Acemoglu and Robinson describe in their new forthcoming book, in which it moves into this narrow corridor, but it's vulnerable and reversible and constantly threatened by benighted forces. So there's not a great deal of reason to be optimistic there. All right, now, what about technological progress? And here is, I'm engaging directly with Bob Gordon and a whole bunch of other economists. There's a paper by Nick Bloom et al. And there's a literature that basically says, look, innovations are harder to come by because the low-hanging fruits have been picked. And so this metaphor of a tree that has low-hanging fruits that we have picked, so we've done air conditioning and we've done antibiotics and we've done indoor plumbing and all these things that Bob Gordon likes. And, but we invented these things already, so are the next inventions going to be harder? And of course, that's wrong, because what science does is it provides us with taller and taller ladders to get to higher and higher fruit. And so it does that because it widens the epistemic base of the the techniques that we use. And so once we understand why techniques work, not only that we can improve existing ones, things that have been used for millennia, like steel or fertilizer, but we can devise entirely new things that nobody dreamed about. And the question is, I'm not trying to argue a very simple linear model that science drives innovation, because we all know that technological progress still has a large component of luck, of accident, of dogged persistence, try every bottle on the shelf kind of methodology. But it's also true, as Pasteur said memorably, fortune favors the prepared mind. And so people who are well-trained and well-schooled are going to do better than amateurs who just putz around in their lab. And of course, there are certain things like genetic engineering or nuclear power, where if you don't know what you're doing, it's a complete non-starter. So the important thing, however, and that's where my main focus is going to be, is that it is a two-way street. And that science advances, not only because people know more, but because they have better tools and instruments to work with. And that's something that we're often sort of forgetting. And what's actually happened is that technology improves the tools and instruments that make science advance. And then as science advances, it provides knowledge that can be used for technology to go even further. So in some sense, technology pulls itself up in some kind of positive feedback loop. And I think that's something that is often overlooked. So let me sort of explain very simply why that's the case. So this is pointed out by a famous historian of science, Derek de Solla Price, who pointed out many years ago that we as humans, we can't do very well science because we are limited by our senses. We can't see things that are microscopically small. We can't see things that are incredibly far. We can't do very many calculations. And we can't sense temperature and pressure and blah, blah, blah. Our senses weren't designed for that. We need instruments. And that, I think, is what he called artificial revelation, which is a wonderful sign. And so some of these stories are very well known. So here are three of them that brought in the scientific revolution, right? So the one on the left is Galileo's telescope. It's not an original. It's a reproduction because there aren't any originals left. On the middle, we have Hooke's microscope. And on the right, you have this Torricelli's barometer, which, of course, led to the discovery of the atmosphere, which is one of the sort of great discoveries of the 17th century, and, of course, led eventually, once you understand there's an atmosphere, it leads to the atmospheric engine, and from the atmospheric engine, you get the steam engine. So you can see the direction from these tools to knowledge to technology right there and then. All right, well, you don't like the scientific revolution. Some people don't like it. Here's the 20th century. I skipped 2 centuries, but trust me, I have many more slides that do this. This is one of the great tools of 20th century technology, X-ray crystallography. Okay, the theory was developed by Max von Laue, a German theoretical physicist. And on the right, you have William Henry Bragg, who built the first spectrometer, the only man to win the Nobel Prize, by the way, together with his son. I think to date that's probably true. But this tool had enormous implications for technology. So this is the most famous use of it, by the way. This is Rosalind Franklin's use of this technique in order to help discover the structure of DNA, for which 2 men got the Nobel Prize, and she got nothing, but, that's 1953. But that's one of the famous uses of this tool. And so if you accept that notion that really what's driving progress is the tools and the instruments that science has to work with, now what does it predict for today? And the answer must be that science today has an arsenal of tools so vastly powerful that everything that came before us looks like toy. And many of them really boggle the mind. And so let's first go to the tools that already existed, okay? So Galileo never dreamed of this. This is the James Webb Space Telescope. It's not quite there. It was supposed to be out in the air last year, but they postponed it. But of course, we still have the Hubble telescope, which is still a great deal more than what Galileo had. But this is, of course, a tool that makes every tool before it looks like a toy. Neither did Louis Pasteur ever dream of this. So this is a Betsy-Held type of stimulated emission depletion microscope, which is used in nanoscopic work. Okay, so this is, you know, a microscope that sees things that would have been unimaginable even 40, 50 years ago with electron microscopy. In fact, microscope technology is so important to science that a whole bunch of microscope developers actually won Nobel Prize in physics, which is rare because usually they don't give it to people who build tools. But this is recognized to be, I'm not going to go through all of those, but I think you get the point. Now, those are tools that are old, right? The microscope and the telescope both derive from the 17th century. But of course, science in the 21st century has tools that nobody even dreamed about, even a few decades ago. So the most perhaps revolutionary of those is lasers. And you know, lasers really is a fabulous research tool. You know, and its properties are clearly highly unusual, you know, and there's a whole list of them here. I don't have time to go through all this, but this is used in a wide range of scientific tools. And you know, you'd wonder, would Isaac Newton not have loved to have a laser? And in fact, there's evidence that he did. Here it is. I plugged this from the internet, so it must be right. But in fact, when lasers were invented in 1960, the inventor Theodore Maiman said that this was basically a solution in search of a problem. You know, he couldn't have been more wrong. It is evolved in one of the most powerful tools that science has at its disposal. So here's a whole bunch of things that it's done for us. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but it's critical, particularly in biochemistry and photochemistry, as well as in neurology, in using laser ablations. The most striking findings that I find is this thing here. Of course, as a historian, I find this terribly interesting. So that they have used LiDAR, which is light radar, which is laser-based, to actually re-examine these Guatemalan forests and shown how vastly larger and more sophisticated a pre-Columbian Maya civilization was in Guatemala. They also were used in confirming one of Einstein's famous hypotheses, namely gravitational waves, which he predicted exactly 100 years ago and were confirmed in 2017 by two physicists who won the Nobel Prize. And of course, finally, and this is still in the future, lasers will be essential in cracking nuclear fusion. And if they do so, this will probably stand as one of the greatest inventions ever made. The other thing that was never available in the past is, of course, high-powered computers. And so I don't have to tell anybody in this room, nobody here could possibly do any research without computers. In fact, I have students asking me, you know, how did anybody ever did research before you had computers? And, you know, that's a good question. Poorly, I think. But so we, you know, what it allows us to do is not only big data, which many economists, of course, do these days, but they also allow us to simulate equations that really have no closed form solutions. And that capability, that simulation capability, has created entirely new fields of research, which are just getting started. So this is just the beginning of them. And there's now almost every field we have has the word computational in front of it. Computational chemistry, computational biology. And so scientists now recognize that there are sort of three ways of doing science: theory, experiment, and computational. It hasn't really hit economics in a big way, but it's a good chance that will change. Now, it's also important to realize that we tend to focus, for some reason, on digital technology. So artificial intelligence and deep learning and so on is all the rage. In fact, I should like to cite Freeman Dyson here, who said that while the 20th century was the age of physics, the 21st may be the age of biology. And that we have developed tools that can analyze and understand living beings at a level that we never dreamed about before, which has huge implications for medicine, for agriculture, and hopefully for ecology, and of course this is particularly true for this new gene drive technique, which allows us to manipulate living beings like we never did before. Now, just to add one sentence, a lot of people feel very uneasy about the development of this technique, probably more so in Europe than in the United States, because of our sort of intuition that this isn't quite right. And the reason it's not quite right is because in some sense we're playing God. And we're manipulating life in the way nature never intended. My answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, is we've always played God. We're just getting better at it. And I'm reminding everybody that God did not create poodles. We did. That's worth remembering. So, you know, how much time do I have?
5 minutes now.
Okay, fine. So just a few notes about productivity. You know, so people say, well, if you're right, why isn't productivity rising? So the productivity picture does look worrisome. Many of you have seen this. This is the rate of labor productivity, and this is very, very close to zero. So the last few quarters have been a little bit better. And so I would like to remind everybody in this room that productivity data that Bob and others rely on really are a different thing from technological progress. And in fact, in my first lecture in economic history, I talk about it. I said, look, we have technological progress, we have total factor productivity growth. Here are 10 reasons why they would not move together. They are not the same thing. And how you measure TFP growth in an economy that's 80% services is, of course, a big issue. Now, so far, mismeasurement hasn't solved the issue, but you know, I'm not sure the last word had been said about this. We keep inventing things. Here are the patent data statistics. There's no slowdown in patenting. Again, that's a poor measure because you know, patenting is not a very good measure of technological progress for a whole bunch of reasons. But at least you know, the effort is still there. So let me sum up the case for techno-optimism and then temper it a little bit. So where Gordon and his fellow travelers, I think, have it wrong, is what they do is they measure the direct effect of technology on output. And what they're forgetting is the indirect effect that technology has on science, and that then science affects technology through the science-technology link, and that way affects the economy. That could be lagged by a decade or by 50 years, we don't know, but eventually it is vastly more powerful. And so what eventually has happened in the last 250 years, ladies and gentlemen, is that technology has to a large extent pulled itself up by the bootstraps. And this is, I think, a positive feedback loop that may not necessarily converge at all, and therefore there is no room for techno-pessimism. So, to put it technologically, we ain't seen nothing yet. So all the same, here's the question. If everything is so good, why is everything so bad? Why do we have all these pessimists out there telling us, you know, that growth will end and that, you know, things are going to be awful? So I have a whole bunch of reasons here. One of them I already mentioned, we economists take the TFP growth figures too seriously. And there also is, I think, a built-in nostalgia for the good old days. And I must say, I've always regarded it, one of my duties as an economic historian, to point out that the old days may have been old, they weren't good. They were terrible in all kinds of dimensions that I could spend the rest of the afternoon here describing to you. If you don't believe me, pick up Steve Pinker's new book with all its flaws and and he points this out in multiple dimensions. The other thing, which I'm really fighting against, but I'm a victim like everybody else, as we grow older, it seems the past looks better, not because it was really better, but we were younger, so things look nicer in some way. This is something you have to resist, and I'm resisting it with great effort. And finally, I think, not finally, there's a lack of imagination for which I do blame Gordon for, an inability to envisage new technology. And what you should really do as a historian is place yourself in 1900 and say, look, conditional on what the world was like in 1900, how likely would our world have seemed to them, okay? And if you know that's not good enough, put yourself in the time of Julius Caesar and ask that question. And then I think use that ratio to predict the future. And finally, there is an argument by psychologists, which I'm not sure I believe, is that by natural selection we are hardwired for excess pessimism because that's the way to survive in the jungle rather than excess, who knows, anyway. So what keeps me up at night if I'm such an optimist? And I think this concern I have is that, that one of the things that modern history shows more than anything else is that you can have a mismatch between our technological abilities and our political abilities. And that's what happened to some extent. A way of interpreting what happened in 1914, it's what happened in 1939, and it's what almost happened in 1962. And had it happened, we wouldn't be sitting here, right? So this is something that does keep me up at night. And so let me sort of maybe wind this up, okay? There's no room for unbridled optimism, even if you believe in the power of technology to keep accelerating. And I'm quoting here from the IMF, the greatest threat to the to the world economy is not technological stagnation, it's political risk. Okay, and we all know the things: protectionism, know-nothingism, anti-intellectualism, populism, fear-mongering, demagoguery, you name it. I mean, all these things are obviously closely intertwined. And the last few years have not been encouraging on that front. And so if I may end with what I think is the understatement, not of the century, but of the millennium, okay? I'm quoting here from Freud's Future of an Illusion in 1927, where he says, while mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature and may be expected to make still greater ones, indeed, it is not possible to establish with certainty, look at the understatement, that a similar advance has been made in the management of human affairs, to which all I can say is, you're not kidding, Ziggy. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great. So I would like to thank Professor MOKYR for one probably of the most fascinating lecture we had at the festival, honestly, and I didn't miss any of the editions. So there are so many suggestions, hints, and the professor has put together literature, different strands, and suggestions from the technological world. So I will like to open up to questions from the audience, and of course, please keep the questions short so that we can have more questions. I have mine as well, so grab one there. Just wait for the microphone, please. Here we go. It's coming.
Is it going to be in Italian or in English? Oh, good.
Yeah, it works. It works.
I just want to ask. It's pretty interesting to be so optimistic in this country now. And my question comes from from our situation right now, and the situation of the politics in USA too. How much can the wrong choices of our politicians influence the future and the progress?
Well, I wish I had a simple answer to that, but let me pick an example, okay, which is close to my heart and everybody's heart in this room, I'm sure, and that's American policy vis-a-vis climate change. Well, clearly, on climate change, we have an administration that is completely, off base, and whether they are clueless or pretend to be clueless, nobody can tell, but clearly they're doing everything that's wrong. But does that really mean, okay, that they will affect the trend that technology has to steer away from fossil fuels into reproducible forms of energy? I don't actually think so. So Trump talks a good game about keeping coal miners in business. But it's quite clear that he cannot do that. That is not going to happen, that people are going to switch to renewable energies for reasons that have nothing to do with government policy. That said, the speed at which things happen, even if they will happen in any case, really matters, because with global warming, okay, time is of the essence. If we do things 10 years earlier, we may be able to stop the temperature rising by half a centigrade, which sounds like a little bit, it's a hell of a lot. And so, I think in the end, the incentives toward doing this will be strong enough even in the absence of government policies. Now, had we had a more sensible government in the United States, this thing might have been a lot faster, and there may have been, some of the worst effects might have been prevented. But I want to add something to what you, since you asked this question, and make a very brief point about how technology really works. And so, well, a great historian of technology called Nathan Rosenberg once wrote a classic paper talking about focusing devices. And he points out that the way technology often advances is that society recognizes there is a problem that they need to solve, and they put the best minds and the best managers to solve this problem. And if it's within their technological capability, even if it's not quite in the set, they do it. Project Manhattan is a classic case, if you want, okay? The war against AIDS is another one. The invention of nitrogen fixing in 1912 is a third one. I mean, many of these cases. Right now, the world is recognizing climate change as a focusing device. That is where scientific and technological and engineering efforts is going to move. And now it's not a simple problem. It has to advance on many fronts, but you can sort of see all the work that's going on, all the way from producing, cowless meat through synthetic biology, all the way to carbon capture and back. Because this is on the agenda, and no Trump will be able to change that. And in that sense, I think the concern about policy may be a bit overstated. Having said that, of course, I wish we had somebody, as does everybody else, that recognized the problem and didn't try to deny it.
Thank you. If you don't mind, just on this, what about appropriation of the benefit from technological progress? Private appropriation, rent-seeking, use of patents, and
so. Oh no! I need to. That's not an easy. So, what has evolved in the Western world over the last 300 years, or 400 years, I should say, is the following. Property rights, intellectual property rights, have bifurcated into two groups. One of them is essentially ownership. So patents give you some kind of property rights on a technique, even for a temporary time. But for most useful knowledge that we produce, we don't actually claim any property rights. I mean, if I write a paper, I don't want to make money off the paper. I want it published. Why do I want it published? Because of reputation mechanisms. And much of our knowledge world is driven by reputation mechanisms. We go to academics and we say, produce knowledge. What do you get for it? Well, you get certain rewards, but it's nothing proportional to what you have invented. There's no proportionality there. What you get is this, a safe and secure existence, but not great riches, and some kind of reputation of your peers. And that is that actually was invented in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. And it was, and many people created science for something which is known as patronage. So, everybody knows the story about Galileo, who wrote this wonderful book called The Starry Messenger, and 6 months later he was offered this wonderful patronage job at the court of the Grand Duke of Florence, where he spent, many years, basically having a good life and writing books. So today we don't call it patronage anymore. We call it tenure. But it's the same thing, essentially. And we have all these wonderful incentives of membership in scientific societies. And at the very peak of the pyramid is the Nobel Prize. And this motivates a great deal of work, but people don't own the work. In fact, they do the reverse. As soon as they have something, and sometimes when they don't have anything, they put it in the public realm because they want to publish it right away. So they give away ownership. They expose it to the public, and they go, here, anybody who wants to read my paper can read it. And of course, 90% of the papers don't get read by anybody, but that's a different story.
That's another issue. Okay, a question here, and one there, and one here. See. Yes.
Hello, Professor. Can I ask my question first? I would like to ask, we know you have done a lot of research on the intellectual rules of industrial revolutions. So China is passing through, or the East passing through, is a kind of different, let's say, process, and they're performing really good on some new kind of technologies like IoT or AI. So what do you think, that can we explain the framework of enlightenment for a Chinese case, or do they have a kind of different route or way of understanding the science, or maybe some kind of different intellectual route? That was the first one. And the second one, which is pretty much related with that one, maybe the new is it possible that maybe the new technologies may allow to create different kind of intellectual routes? For example, like a blockchain or IoT, it's not possible to take a patent. Like when you publish, it's online and everyone can see it. So maybe this may change this following a same intellectual route from. You got what I mean?
Yeah, well, let me take those two questions one at a time. You're absolutely right about China. In fact, I have argued repeatedly that one of the things that sets China apart from the West is that the West, very early on in the 15th, 16th century, develops these notions of intellectual property rights in one form or another, but that in China that concept is completely absent. China never had a patent system, and in fact the reason that they have a patent system is because much of the innovation and the invention was carried out by mandarins, by people who were members of the imperial bureaucracy. And so this was really part of their work. In Europe, innovation and science really are almost completely farmed out to the private sector and always have been. So that's why you need it. And so today, even so China has some formal structure of intellectual property rights, but I don't think it's in their culture yet. And so when Trump is railing a bit that Chinese are stealing their stuff, the Chinese don't think they're stealing it. I think these intellectual property rights don't really exist, and if it's once it's and they get intuitively the non-rivalrousness of knowledge, right? So if I give you my knowledge, I don't have any less myself, so it's okay for you to steal it because I don't have any less. That's sort of the underlying notion, and I think that's part of the disagreement today between the American administration and the Chinese administration, that America has had intellectual property rights and patents since it was born, since the American Republic was founded, and it's always been very critical to the way it's proceeded. And this has not been the case in China or in non-Western societies. Your other point is actually rather interesting, and I don't have much time to go into that, but you're absolutely right. There may be other forms of protecting intellectual property rights. The most important one has always been, in addition to patent system, is secrecy. So people try to keep things secret, and there are cases in which reverse engineering isn't possible, right? The classic case, which I'm sure everybody here knows, is Coca Cola. So Coca Cola has never been patented, but the formula is sitting in Atlanta in a vault under 24-hour, guard, and nobody quite knows how to make Coca Cola because the recipe is kept secret. It can't be reverse engineered, or at least nobody has succeeded so far. And there are many cases in history in which people try to use secrecy as a way of protecting their property rights. And what you're pointing out is, I think correctly, is that new technology will allow maybe different things or make reverse engineering particularly difficult. But remember one thing, as technology improves to protect your property rights, so does the technology to hack it. And you get this constant race between protectors and hackers, and this is probably going to end up in some kind of tie. So, in some sense, I don't see on the horizon a clear substitute for patenting, even so everybody understands what's wrong with the patenting system. But my main point is that scientists and intellectuals in general don't use intellectual property rights by excluding others. It's the other way around. We want to include others. I don't want, not only that I want you to read my paper. Where intellectual property rights comes in, once you've read it and you use it, you cite me. And if you don't cite me, I get very angry. And if you don't believe that, you haven't talked to any of the academics in this room. I mean, that's the worst thing. If I want a citation. I want credit, not profit. I don't want your money. I want your footnote.
But if they buy your book, it's fine. Anyway, there was a question there, and that is the last question because we are running out of time. Sorry. Sì, a tutti quanti, io sono il chair e decido chi do la parola. Mi scusi, ma vi vedo tutti io, quindi vedo anche i tempi. Il ragazzo al centro e poi credo che dobbiamo chiudere.
Yeah, you need
So,
a mic. I can't hear you
microphone
without a
also
mic.
for the people in the other room.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I have a very simple, not a question. I know that it's not a point of secular stagnation, but don't you think that your theory of this technological optimism is not actually what is necessary to save the planet, at the meantime having degrowth, so in a way combining these talks of reducing growth, but in a way to preserve the planet?
I don't want to reduce growth. I think we need growth to save the planet, not to stop growth. I mean, this is a terrible misconception because not all forms of growth are created equal. We will not be having, if we're having the kind of growth we had in the 20th century, in which we burned huge amount of oil, huge amount of coal, huge amount of natural gas. We used vast amounts of iron and other metals, and we dumped vast amounts of fertilizer on fields. Then the planet would be in trouble. What I see on the horizon are ways to substitute away from those resource-intensive techniques into ways in which we can save resources, we can save energy, and we can, and in fact, undo some of the mess we made. Because look, I mean, the way technology proceeds, ladies and gentlemen, it is not a nice monotonic path. Almost every new technique that's ever been invented has had unforeseen, unanticipated, and unintended consequences, by definition, right? Because it's something novel. So when people first learned to burn coal in manufacturing process during the Industrial Revolution, they had no clue that burning this coal eventually would lead to climate change. And so what do you do when you discover that the technique you had screwed up? The answer is you come up with a technological fix. You do a technique that not only doesn't do that, but fixes what you've done. So carbon capture would be a technique, a form of growth that would save the planet. It wouldn't use, LED lighting or, bacteria that eat plastics. Think of it, you've all seen those pictures of these vast islands of plastic refuse floating around in the Pacific. Suppose somebody built a bacterium that ate plastic. These things would slowly melt away. That would be growth, but it would be growth of the right kind. That's what I'm thinking of. With the correct incentives, both government and private, these techniques are within reach because we have the tools to develop them. That's the kind of growth I want.
Bene, dobbiamo chiudere perché ci sarà un altro incontro che segue e qui ne hanno alzata anche molti dietro di lei, ma dobbiamo chiudere perché devono preparare la sala. Benissimo, al prossimo anno allora la sedremo qui. Vi chiedo allora un ultimo applauso per il professor MOKYR perché se l'è decisamente meritato. Congratulations. E buona continuazione di festival a tutti. Se qualcuno vuol fare qualche would you mind maybe to talk a little bit with somebody coming down if they like, ma dobbiamo lasciare la sala a preparare. Grazie.